Nicola.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And before I begin my speech, I'd like to inform you that I'll be sharing my time with the Member of Parliament for Chilliwack Hope. And I would first like to take a moment to share a few words on behalf of the citizens of Central Okanagan, Similkameen, Nicola. We are collectively shocked, saddened, and outraged at the discovery of an unmarked gravesite for 215 children at the former Indigenous residential school in Kamloops. This discovery is difficult to put into words, and I would ask that we all think of the Tk'emlúp First Nation who made this deeply disturbing discovery. I'd also like to ask that we think of the many families in Indigenous communities throughout our region who had children at the Kamloops residential school, many of whom did not return. And I'd also like to take a moment to read into the record some of the comments from Indigenous chiefs in British Columbia. I believe their comments must be heard. From my own region, Mr. Speaker, from the Upper Nicola Band Chief Harvey McLeod, who I've made some brief remarks at the Take Note debate on. I'd like to read it in full. From Chief McLeod, we always knew that this was happening there, but it was in our own minds. We had no proof other than our own experience. We hear really horrific stories about what happened and dealing with our people that passed on and what they were forced to do, to bury them. And it wasn't the grown-ups, it was the babies. So much hurt and pain came out in a matter of seconds. Just felt for our families that all went there. We had a large number of people from this community, Upper Nicola, that went to school there. We all had different experiences, but a lot of hurt and pain and shame and anger leaving there. I went back to the 2 years that I attended. I know there were incidents happening there because I went through a lot of experiences myself. I know people that just disappeared, and we assumed that they ran away and got away and are at home somewhere. We never did see them again. We as communities and leadership will find the best ways of doing this and taking care of our people. We want to all be on the same page when it comes to having the ceremony to bring our people home. It's going to take a lot of strength to walk with our people while they remember the hurt and pain from that school. And it will be so much better when we're all united, working together to ensure we're there for our citizens. Mr. Speaker, I'd like to mention some words from Alice Ross, now an MLA for Skeena, and also a former chief counselor for the Haisla Nation. Here it goes. Normally I'd do a live video, but I doubt I could hold it together for this topic. The kids found buried at the Kamloops Residential School. This is reliving the trauma for the survivors, and it is shocking to see for their family members and non-Aboriginals alike. I like to say that you will come to terms with it, or that the feeling goes away, but it doesn't. But now anyway, mainly because this is still fresh in the minds of survivors, it hasn't gone away for me when I came to understand it in 2004. To be clear, I was sad and angry when I learned the truth because my parents wouldn't talk about it, just in bits and pieces. I learned to live with it and used it for motivation to build a better future and break the cycle, well-known term with First Nations. 17 years ago, I understood what happened overall. I decided to help fix issues of today instead of my revenge ideas. This Kamloops school story brought it all back to the day I sat in our archives and broke down. Repatriation will be traumatizing, but needed. Those are powerful words, Mr. Speaker. I was deeply moved to hear them, as I am certain many members in this place also. So many of local Indigenous communities were impacted and traumatized by these institutions because that's what they were. They were not school like you and I went to. I cannot think of a parent, a worse situation, your children being taken away from you only to never return home. Did they run away? I cannot imagine how it would feel to not know for so many years. Until one day your worst nightmare comes along when you hear about these graves. And learning of these graves alone only raises more questions. And they are troubling questions. And in this place, we must do everything we can to help find answers to those questions and to help bring accountability to Indigenous families, including those who attended the schools. I say attended, but in reality, it was more like they were incarcerated in those schools. Today's opposition motion from the NDP is but our first steps in helping to provide some answers, and what I expect will be a long journey. I think it's important we must also consider that reconciliation will mean different things to different people. We must also recognize this because we must not allow the usual Ottawa one-size-fits-all approach to finding true reconciliation. It is not First Nation. It is First Nations. Each nation is unique, is special, and it is time Ottawa started to recognize that. It is not unlike the institutions in Kamloops. It and others like it were first created as a one-size-fits-all approach from Ottawa. Let us finally take a new approach that works in partnership with our Indigenous communities. And on that note, I will now comment on this Opposition Day motion. I think we must be careful in this place to avoid making the mistakes of the past. And I appreciate how this motion is well-intentioned. However, at least for many First Nations in my community members are still in shock. Many are holding meetings, and there are great many discussions underway. My point being is that I have not been directly contacted by one of the First Nations in my riding for guidance on this, and I highly doubt that many other members have either. Yet, here we are with a motion deciding what we think we must do to help our Indigenous communities after such a traumatic and horrific discovery. Again, Mr. Speaker, I appreciate the motivation of the opposition. I believe that the NDP is sincere here, but it has to be pointed out we are moving on a motion without proper direction from those we are trying to help. Some would rightfully call this a Ottawa knows best approach. In my view, at some point, we must recognize this approach has not served our country well over the years. I do not often agree with our Prime Minister, Mr. Speaker, but recently he made a comment that I believe we should all be mindful of. And his comment was, and I quote, "If it were only done by ministers, if it were only done by Ottawa to solve these challenges, it might have been done long ago, but it would have been done wrong," said our Prime Minister. He continued, "You cannot move forward on true reconciliation unless it's done in partnership with Indigenous communities, leaders, and individuals." Now, it would be very easy, Mr. Speaker, to play politics with this issue. It would be said that the current government has had 5 years to take action, and that the ministers responsible have failed. And that the current government could say, but what about the former government failed in 2009? Mr. Speaker, we could go on and on and on, and eventually we'd go back to 1969 when this institution in Kamloops was first taken over by the federal government of the day, and ask why they didn't close it then. Why was it not closed until 1978? Politicizing this issue will not provide the leadership that we as parliamentarians need to provide. I believe I've made my point that we should all be concerned when we're here passing a motion without direction from Indigenous communities, precisely as we are doing here. I would also add that I've heard the Prime Minister explain the reasons why his government believes court action that this Opposition Day motion proposes to cease is necessary. Now, the Prime Minister has argued that he believes it will ultimately produce a fair outcome for the victims and their families. I don't know if the Prime Minister will continue to make that same argument, Mr. Chair. Often we rely on the courts to provide fair and equitable outcomes for challenging cases, more so when politics may interfere with that process. However, I will also note it's easy to dismiss the court actions as being belligerent and litigious approach to justice, as it says in the motion, precisely as the fourth party has done here. As I recall, it took the Prime Minister several minutes to explain why his government supported the court action and why they believed, at least at the time, it would provide a fair outcome. In politics, it's often says, when you're explaining, you are losing. As I have stated, I believe the intention of the fourth party is to be sincere here. They mean well, and in balance, I am keenly aware that Canada, we've literally created an Indigenous law legal industry. It's been going on for decades. The lawyers certainly will profit from it. Many of the Indigenous communities in my riding, Mr. Chair, at least, have not. Ultimately, it's about the people, the victims, the survivors, their family, and that is who I'm focused on. So I'm prepared to support this Opposition Day motion. There are some cautions that I have and I've shared, but in balance against inaction, we must act. And this Opposition Day motion takes steps in that direction. I will be supporting it as a result. Thank you for hearing my comments today, Mr. Chair.